Hello, and welcome to this week's video homework. Today, we're going to be talking about how matter cycles through various environments and ecosystems, and how energy powers the cycle of that matter. Really, we're going to be trying to identify how the various things, the matter in our world, moves from location to location. And generally, we want to understand how everything on Earth works. So the things that we're going to be discussing today really cover and touch upon the function of everything, not even just living things, but everything on our Earth. Individuals who study this matter are called ecologists, and they try to track and measure how much matter of different types, whether it's oxygen or carbon or water or nitrogen, how much is moving from location to location. Those ecologists describe 4 different places where matter can be here on Earth. The atmosphere is the air, and it's mostly gases, mostly nitrogen gas, but also the oxygen that we use to breathe, as well as a lot of water that forms clouds, and a bunch of other gases like carbon dioxide and ozone that really impact the vast majority of life on Earth. Another location could be the Geosphere. By that we mean rocks. And this can be talking about the solid rocks that you see underneath your feet when you're walking to school, or it could be the magma and lava that is boiling up from deep within the Earth to build up mountains. Another location is the Hydrosphere. Hydro from the word for water. So the Hydrosphere is the oceans, lakes and streams, as well as the frozen water in glaciers in the Arctic and Antarctic. And finally, the last location is called the Biosphere, bio for life. So this is where any living organism is existing, whether it's plants or animals or bacteria. And specifically, the most important reactions in the biosphere are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And obviously, you can't separate these 4 locations apart from each other. They are always interacting. There are birds in the atmosphere, there are fish in the hydrosphere, there are living things throughout all the others, and they all depend on each other, and they all interact, and matter cycles between them. So let's look at an example of one of those cycles. Let's look at the water cycle. You may have learned about this in middle school. It's a common topic. But in the water cycle, you have evaporation, lifting water up out of the oceans and lakes, condensation in the form of clouds, you have precipitation in the form of rain and snow, and then you have runoff, which carries that water back down through the streams and lakes down back to the ocean. So there's this cycle of water. And if you were to really get into it, you could identify all the different connections between where the water moves and how it transitions from place to place. But the key thing to note here is that the reason water is always moving in this cycle is because it's being powered by the sun. The sun causes the evaporation, and that evaporation brings the liquid water up to higher elevations, and then gravity pulls that water back down. And so you have this cycle which is being powered primarily by the sun. But in that process of the water cycle, as the water runs across the streams and down the rivers, it's carrying with it a lot of minerals and rocks from the tops of mountains into the oceans. So we'll get back to that when we talk about the geologic cycle in a bit. Another important cycle that scientists track is the carbon cycle that we've already been talking about. And really there are 2 different types of the carbon cycle. There's the fast cycle, which is what we primarily talked about, in which living organisms doing photosynthesis and cellular respiration, they absorb carbon dioxide, turn it into glucose. That carbon and glucose then gets converted back to carbon dioxide through cellular respiration. And this happens both in the oceans and on land. However, the other part of the carbon cycle is called the slow carbon cycle. And that doesn't necessarily involve living organisms anymore. It has mostly to do with the rocks. It's the geology part. And so over millions of years, some of that carbon gets trapped underground, or it sinks to the bottom of the oceans and sits at the bottom of the oceans and gets stuck there for millions and millions of years. Again, if we include the geologic cycle, eventually volcanoes will erupt and emit more of that carbon back out into the atmosphere. So it does cycle, but it takes a long time. Humans, however, have been disrupting that slow cycle and actually encouraging it to happen much quicker. So over the past couple hundred years, we've been emitting much more carbon back to the atmosphere that has taken millions of years to be absorbed back down underground. So we're disrupting the slow cycle. And I actually want to zoom in on this image here. In this image of the carbon cycle, scientists have gone through and they've measured and they've listed numbers of how much carbon is moving from location to location. And the numbers that they use actually represent huge amounts of carbon, gigatons of carbon. That's millions and millions of tons of carbon every year that are being transferred between various locations in the Earth. However, the red numbers that are in this diagram are representing what impact humans are having on this cycle. Without humans, the amount of carbon that's being absorbed into the ocean and exchanged back out to the atmosphere would be balanced, 90 and 90. But due to humans, there's actually a difference. Humans are having an impact. And especially if you go onto land, it would otherwise be balanced, the amount of carbon going into photosynthesis and the amount that is coming out through plant respiration or bacterial microbial respiration would be balanced, 120, 60 to 60. But it comes down to humans burning fossil fuels that emits more carbon out into the atmosphere and disrupts that balance. So there's more carbon coming out currently than is going in to the ground and the soil and living organisms. More carbon is entering the atmosphere than is currently going in. And that means the carbon cycle is disrupted. And so scientists are studying it in great detail, trying to understand specifically what we are doing and how we can stop it. I want you guys to have a chance to look at a little bit of data on the carbon cycle across the world. If you want to look at this data for yourself, you can go to this link right here, and I'll have it down in the notes. So in this graph here, this data is actually coming from multiple years, and it shows how much carbon is entering or exiting the atmosphere across every single year for the past 50 years. And an observation you might make is that the amount of carbon dioxide throughout the summer months, May, June, July, August, and September, is much lower than the amount of carbon dioxide in the winter months, November, December, January, and February, and March. And why might that be? If we look at this map here, the green areas show the amount of primary productivity. That is a scientific description of essentially the amount of plants. So you can see this graph and see wherever there's green, that's where plants are growing. However, if we go to December, we can see how many plants are growing during the winter months, and you may be able to notice that there's a lot more green across the earth in August than there is in December. Obviously, this makes sense. Plants grow better when it's warmer than when it's colder. How does that connect to the amount of carbon dioxide in the air? Well, plants do photosynthesis when they are growing, and photosynthesis absorbs carbon dioxide. And so this carbon dioxide is being absorbed when plants are growing during the June, July, August months. And then the plants stop absorbing as much carbon dioxide during the winter months, the November, December, January, and February. And so there is always a yearly flux of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In this next graph, This is measurements that have been taken that show the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as well as the average temperature in the Antarctic regions. And it goes back 800,000 years into the past. And if you look at these two graphs, they look remarkably similar. As the amount of carbon dioxide changes, the temperatures follow directly with them. Both of them have lots and lots of different fluctuations. You can see lots of changes in the average amount of carbon dioxide and the average temperature in the Antarctic. They match really, really close, and they change a lot. So our world naturally has a lot of variability. The climates change very naturally. But one thing to notice is how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere in the past 800,000 years. The highest numbers are around 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and the lowest numbers are about 150 parts per million. In our world today, if this graph continued to current times, the actual amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere would be over 400 parts per million, way above what it's been at the highest peaks over the past million years. We are far exceeding the historical averages of both carbon dioxide and temperatures. Now, why might that be? This next graph gives us a clue. This graph is showing how much carbon dioxide is being added to our atmosphere every year. And this is only showing over the past 200 years. While the previous graph was over hundreds of thousands, this is only showing about 200. And so around 1850, we really started burning coal to produce energy. But it wasn't until around the 1900s that it was a measurable amount of carbon dioxide that was being added. And really, it wasn't until the 1950s, just in the last 50 years, the amount of carbon that we've been emitting has skyrocketed. That extra gigatons of carbon has contributed to our global climate change, to the record high temperatures across the entire Earth. And it all has to do with the carbon cycle. However, there also are other cycles besides the carbon and water cycle. There's also the nitrogen cycle. The thing to know about the nitrogen cycle is that our atmosphere is actually primarily nitrogen. It's nitrogen gas in the form of N2. However, this chemical, nitrogen gas, is completely useless to most living organisms. We can't use it even though we need nitrogen in order to survive. There are only some bacteria, mostly in the soil, that can fix nitrogen gas and turn it into these other chemicals like ammonium, nitrites, and nitrates. That's ammonia, nitrites, and nitrates. And only once nitrogen is changed into these other molecules is it able to be used by plants and animals and other decomposers. We use the nitrogen to make proteins and to build up our bodies. And so it's essential for life to live. And without nitrogen, life is not there. One of the big reasons why the oceans, where it's very wet, aren't covered in algae and growing plants over every inch is because there's not enough nitrogen in the oceans for life to grow. And so the nitrogen cycle is this cycle in which nitrogen is pulled in by some bacteria, turned into these important compounds, ammonia, nitrites, and nitrates, and those cycle between plants and animals and decomposers over and over, except slowly over time, some of the nitrogen gets put back into the atmosphere, and some of this nitrogen ends up at the bottom of the ocean and is unavailable to most organisms. And so more nitrogen must be absorbed by these nitrogen-fixing soil bacteria for this cycle to occur. And the whole reason the nitrogen is moving around and around is because it's being powered by the energy of the sun absorbed by plants, and used by these different living organisms. So I want to make it really clear. The matter in our ecosystems cycles. They go in circles, never being destroyed and never being created. But the reason they move is primarily from the energy of the sun. Both the water cycle, evaporating water, that is powered by the sun. And the movement of carbon and nitrogen is also powered by the sun. The movement of any material must have an energy source. And that energy source eventually gets released as heat, which is not useful anymore. However, there's one more cycle that I want to talk about briefly, and it's the geologic cycle. The geologic cycle is the movement of rocks and materials in our Earth. Now, these rocks are not actually powered by the sun. The movement of these rocks are actually powered from heat trapped deep within Earth that is slowly escaping. So when the heat melts some rock, it lifts that magma up to the surface where it erupts, creating mountains and volcanoes, and erupts as lava. Once it sits and cools on the surface, the rain erodes it away, carries it downstream, absorbing minerals as it goes until it reaches the ocean. The whole time it's doing that, it's interacting with living organisms, going through the various nitrogen and carbon cycles and water cycles and all that stuff. But then once it reaches the ocean, some of it will slowly sink down to the bottom of the ocean and get stuck there until the tectonic plates slowly, and so we're talking millions and millions, if not billions of years, get absorbed back down underneath other tectonic plates, melted again, and returned to the surface. This whole thing is being powered again by the heat of the Earth. The heat inside Earth is limited. There's not an infinite amount of it, and it will eventually run out. What happens when it runs out is that Earth will become a lot more like Mars. No more mountains will be built, and so the nutrient cycles will stop, life will run out, there'll be no more magnetic protection from the sun, and the sun's energy will blast the atmosphere off into space. And this will take, again, billions of years, but it is a limited lifespan. And I find that really amazing. I find it amazing that everything that we touch here on Earth is being powered by the sun and by the heat that's trapped within the center of the Earth. There is nothing around us that we touch or interact with that isn't being powered, that isn't being changed and moved from place to place by anything but the sun and the heat from deep within our Earth. So it's sort of astounding that you can look around everything around you, from the electricity that's coming out of this machine to the materials that make up your house to the air that you're breathing. All of it is moving around, and it's all functional and helpful to living organisms, but temporary. Over a long period of time, all of the energy from both within the Earth and from the sun will eventually run out. But that's not going to happen for a really long time, billions of years, probably another 10 billion years before that occurs. So for now, we get the benefit of living in this time period where things still cycle and energy still flows. So I hope that was helpful. And if you have any questions, make sure you write them down, because we will be discussing them in class. Thanks. Bye.
Walking the view, cupping